Hi, this is Greg Kilstrom. Welcome to Season 3 of The Agile World, where we discuss customer and employee experience, organizational and workforce transformation, and how business can adapt and continually improve in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed in this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles, or get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. Today we're going to talk about pivoting into a better outcome and what to do and not to do when faced with the opportunity to change directions. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Tony Guarnaccia, founder, Results Trained. First, why don't you tell me a little bit about what you do at Results Trained?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. And thanks for having me on the show. So what we do is we help businesses dramatically increase their revenue by making them more profitable. And we do that by putting them through the system we create called the results loop.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about your history and how you were able to pivot into better opportunities by making the right choice at the right time. You started a marketing agency, something I'm very familiar with as well, and saw a need to make a change. So talk a little bit about that. What prompted you to consider the future direction of where you were headed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've had an agency called Big Fish Results for 8 years or so. It's been a good run, but I really saw that agencies don't really have much of a future because you don't have to look too far to understand that software is eating, traditional businesses. I think, having friends that are venture capitalists and just speaking with a lot of people in the industry, just the valuations of agencies have declined. You can't, it's not really a sellable asset. And if you're, in business, unfortunately, a lot of small businesses don't think this way, but you really have to think about the end goal, like where you want to be at the end. You don't want to get to your retirement years and realize that you have a worthless business. And unfortunately, I find a lot of agencies going in that direction. So I wanted to, move in a different direction and move more towards the software and also towards training.
Gotcha. And just out of curiosity, I mean, so I had a marketing agency. I ran it for about 14 years and sold it. And so, there were plenty of reasons for doing that, but just curious if, was part of it also not only the business component, but were you personally ready for a different challenge, or, was any of that a cause of it as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, it's easy to get burnt out in an agency. Unfortunately, a lot of clients see you as not on their team, but it's a weird dynamic.
Yeah.
But sometimes they think you're the enemy. And so what I wanted to do was do something that's more aligned with my clients and their interests and whoever I serve, which, I think software and training is definitely more able to do that. And also, and so many things are changing nowadays, obviously. But there was also a big shift I noticed over the past few years with more and more businesses, especially large ones, bringing those capabilities in-house. So, years ago, with agencies, they were needed because, they had the specialty experience in SEO or advertising, digital advertising, not as much people doing it. And so, it was kind of a more of a valuable thing. Now, more people know this, and so businesses are turning more of this in-house. So it's just, yes, I mean, absolutely, 10 years ago, having an agency and selling it like you did, great idea. I think the future of it is going to be different. And so I'm always trying to look at where are things going, not where have they been, and position myself for success in the future.
Yeah. So you mentioned the kind of the relationship to the customer is different between running a marketing or consulting agency versus a software company. Any other differences, or maybe even the biggest difference that you've noticed in running one type of company versus the other?
Well, the biggest one is probably scalability. So a lot of challenges you have with an agency, it's difficult to scale. A lot of agencies will try to solve that problem by focusing on a vertical. But, for me, that's not as interesting because I like diversity. Also for employees, kind of doing the same thing in and out. is not as interesting. And so from a personal standpoint, I think it's, I like the variety. Plus, I think that's where a lot of the innovation comes from. But, scalability, if you want to scale, it's definitely better to focus on a vertical. But the ultimate way to scale, what I always say, if you want to scale, have focus. If you want to go beyond that, have systems and processes. And if you really want to scale, turn that into a training company and a software company, which is essentially what I've done.
Yeah. So who are the audiences you're focused on most now, and what kind of led you to that direction?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of this relates to my agency. So what I noticed with my agency is most businesses, and really actually to take this up a higher level, to have success in anything, what I've discovered is you really need to have three things. You need to understand what you need to do, you need to understand how to do it, and then you have to actually take action. And so the way I look at that in describing what I do is I help businesses identify their challenges, understand how to fix them, and then help them take action to actually fix them. And so what I find with most businesses, especially smaller businesses, they focus on the how. How do I do SEO? How do I do AdWords? How do I do a podcast? And so what I found the best companies do is they have they have down the what, which is a fancy word or a simplified word for the fancy word of strategic planning. And so
Yeah.
I pivoted my company to help on the strategic planning component, and that's where I created my training company. But before that, I actually started. I created a software company out of it, and so I created a system where you could do strategic planning online and map personas and identify your offers and funnels and all this stuff. And it didn't get the traction it needed. And what I realized is the reason why is people didn't really understand the need for it. And so that's where I started my other company called Results Training to actually teach the people the framework and why it's important first, and then kind of the secondary component is now the software.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So you've mentioned even in the short time we've been talking so far, several different, let's call it, iterations of your business, your career, and things like that. Might be hard to answer this question even, but what kind of guided you from to rethink some of what you were doing, or just to think of it in a different way? Is like, was there some kind of realization that would happen at key points, and what kind of brought about the desire to change, I guess?
Well, I think it's important when you're launching anything to listen. And so what I would try to do is to use kind of a Silicon Valley term, I would do an MVP, a minimum viable product. I'd throw something out there, see if it was getting traction. If it wasn't, I'd change direction. And so I did that a number of times to figure out what is and what isn't resonating. Because I might be able to solve a problem, but if people can't understand their need, it's not going to go anywhere. So you have to go through multiple iterations in anything you do to really kind of find the formula that gets the traction that will enable you to really grow.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, and we certainly hear. I think the stories that we hear about success with pivoting are certainly the notable standouts of, well, they used to do this and then they made this pivot and now they're a household name and stuff. But a lot of times pivoting can lead to what I kind of refer to as like a death spiral of sorts, where a company keeps trying to find a fit, they don't find it, they keep moving. And I mean, early on in my career, living through the original internet boom, there were a number of companies that just kind of fit that map, as well as plenty of companies today. What advice would you give for someone that is trying to determine, is pivoting one direction or the other the right approach, or like, is that even the right way of thinking? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things I talk about all the time is resilience and the ability to stay and and kind of adapt. I think just as important is the opposite of that is knowing when to quit. And so if you're not getting traction, so how do you define that? Well, there's been a lot written about this, but essentially you want to have product market fit. You want to have a product that's solving the need for a market that's very clear. And so from a software perspective, they call that the wow moment. And so if you're building something someone has to be able to understand it quickly and realize the value very quickly. And so the quicker you can do that, the more likely you're going to have success. If you're not getting that, then you really have to go in a different direction. And ultimately, if you can't find that, you have to go in a completely different direction, do something completely different.
Yeah, yeah. That's so have you had any times where you made the wrong pivot and then you had to quickly, course correct, or how have you dealt with that um in your, in your career?
Absolutely, yeah. I've had more failures than successes, unfortunately, in many
Yeah.
different ways. But I think that's how you learn and how you go out there. And so, my agency had a decent level of success. It wasn't really what I wanted to do, but so that's why I started the software company. That software company didn't get the traction as I mentioned, so then I pivoted that into a training company. But then, oddly enough, as I started doing more, one of my initiatives for this year was to do more promotion for myself as my own personal brand. And what's interesting is I realized that podcasts were a great way to do that. And so I actually reinvented my software company that I had a couple, 3, 4 years ago for planning and adapt it for podcasting. And so that is starting to get a lot of traction. It's you're starting to hit something when people ask for it, when you just kind of give an elevator pitch and they're already
Yeah.
interested. And so
Yeah.
I'm starting to get a lot more of that. And really all it is the software I created 4 or 5 years ago. It's just for a specific vertical, and that's what I learned in that process is sometimes you have to narrow down the audience very specifically so it's a little bit clearer so people get it, because I had too much functionality in terms of that last, the software, the planning software I had, the strategic planning software. I had too much and people couldn't get it because it was overwhelming. So what I did is I literally just stripped it down to its bare essence and branded it for a specific niche, in this case, live streams, podcasts, things like that, and it's already getting tremendous traction.
That's great. Yeah, that's a great thing to hear. So I guess, your advice for someone that, let's say somebody's they thought they were doing the right thing, and they're kind of at an impasse, let's say, but are looking for what they should do to try to figure out, is what they have salvageable, is it time to walk, as you mentioned before. What would your first advice for them to do, like any questions they should ask themselves, any, what would you recommend?
Well, the first thing you want to think about is what is your runway. So, in terms of financing this, do you have the revenues that will last you through the time it takes to iterate and figure out if you're actually going to have success? And so, I
Yeah.
would start there and say, look, am I actually going to be able to see my idea through fruition? So, if this idea is going to cost me, $30,000, and I make 10,000 a month, but it's going to take 6 months to build it, then you got a problem. And so
Yeah.
you want to kind of look at your numbers very realistically and say, is this something possible to do? And if it isn't, what alternatives do I have? Can I get investment? That's a long way to go. Can I do freelance? Can I get revenue from another source? Like really going through the process. But I would start with your cash flow, because if you don't have the cash coming in, you're not going to be able to sustain. And so the question is, can I get market adoption before I run out of that money? Which, from an investor standpoint, they talk about runway, which is, something someone can Google
Yeah.
and learn plenty about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Gotcha. Great. Well, one last question. Let's go back to the marketing agency world for a second, because again, it's something I, even though I'm not involved in it directly myself either, I think about it a bit. So I agree with what you said earlier, as far as I think the marketing agency world is changing dramatically, and I think they're going to look, the ones that are still existing, let's say similar enough to the ones of today, they're still going to look different 5 years from today. What do you see as what does a successful marketing agency look like in 5 years? It's, again, there's going to be more automation. There's going to be more in-house people that are taking some of those positions, but they'll still exist to some extent. Like what's the best approach a marketing agency could take to be, let's call it, future proof?
Yeah, so aside from what we talked about before, having systems and processes and software if possible so they can scale, I think
Yeah.
the best way to adapt would be to own a niche, something very narrow. Because or the other option would be, which is harder to do, is to be more full stack. So full stack marketers are valuable because they kind of understand the whole process. They understand every part. That I
Yeah.
think is going to be very valuable. The problem is that's hard to do because to hire people like that, it's very difficult to have someone that knows everything. Kind of
Right.
personally, where I moved my skill set and my agency was more towards conversion optimization because there's so many components to that in persuasion and in so what I would be looking at if I was to reinvent my agency and stick with that, I would say, okay, what is something that can't be automated and what's something that's kind of foundational? And to
Yeah.
me, persuasion, psychology, those kinds of things are very foundational, and it's not going to change with technology. And I think the need to optimize things like through conversion optimization is a whole discipline now that a lot of people don't know. That's where I'd be positioning myself, is on that side.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Well, Tony, thanks for joining the show. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
Sure. So if anyone wants to connect with me directly, go to my personal website, which is meettonyg.com. Scroll down to the bottom. You can connect with me via social media. LinkedIn is probably the best one. And then if anyone wants to kind of follow my journey with launching this software company, you can go to castosity.com and learn more there. And I'm actually doing a video series that I'm going to release later, where every day I do a video of what I'm doing to scale this from zero to $1 million in less than a year.
Great. That's great. I'd like to follow along as well. So that's great. Well, again, I'd like to thank Tony Guarnaccia, founder of Results Train, for joining the show. And thanks for listening to the Agile World with Greg Kilstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. I'm your host, Greg Kilstrom. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, from my website at theagile.world.